The Training Beta podcast is an offshoot of a website, trainingbeta.com, which is a hub of resources for rock climbers. Over there, we have online training programs for climbers of all abilities, whether you're a boulderer or a route climber. We have them in ebook form or subscription form. We also have coaches Alex and Matt who see people remotely from all over the world to help them reach their goals in climbing by creating individualized plans for them. We also have nutrition services with me and mindset coaching with me. I have been certified in both of those things and work with climbers exclusively. You can find everything at trainingbeta.com, and we hope to see you over there. This is the Training Beta podcast, and I'm your host, Neely Quinn. Thanks for joining me for another episode all about training for climbing and all things climbing. Today, I have Dr. Tyler Nelson on the show again. I don't actually know how many times he's been on the show. It's a lot. If you go to the show notes, every one of his episodes is linked there so you can learn from him. He is really up to date on research about climbing. He is a clinician working with climbers all over the world, helping them recover from injuries and helping them strength train. You can find him at c4hp.com. That's Camp for Human Performance. Actually, it's campforhumanperformance.com, and then his Instagram is C4HP, where he's very active. He also has a Patreon where he gives even more information, and he just started a new podcast called Climbing Science, which is exclusively on his Patreon, which I believe is $5 a month. And his Patreon is C4HP. So today we're going to be talking about finger strength to weight ratios. That's really hard. Strength to weight ratios and your climbing performance and how those two things correlate. Because we all know that training our fingers is a good idea for climbing, but we may not know like when is enough. Like is there a point where it actually does harm? Or how correlated is it with injuries? So Tyler's going to tell us about some research and his clinical experience with those things. And hopefully you find this interesting. Just know that Tyler is very scientific in his talk, and I always try to like back him up and make him explain things a little bit more simply, but these episodes are generally well loved by nerds. So this is for you. All right, here's Dr. Tyler Nelson. Enjoy, and I'll talk to you on the other side. All right, welcome back to the show, Tyler. Thanks for talking to me today.
It's great. Nice to see you again. It's been a while.
Yes, for sure. So for anybody who doesn't know who you are, please introduce yourself.
So my name is Tyler. I'm I went to chiropractic school, 10 years ago now, 11 years ago now, that has a master's degree in exercise science and that doesn't do any of that anymore in my normal day-to-day job. I had a clinic for 4 years before COVID, but always focused on musculoskeletal injuries and climbing stuff. And since then it's been mostly just like finger testing and performance testing and rehabilitation of upper extremity injuries. So I don't really do traditional chiro stuff at all. And all my business is remote consulting and in-person ultrasonography programming stuff.
Okay, so just to be clear, you do both injury protocols for people remotely and you do you train people, you coach people to get better
Yeah,
at climbing as
I
well.
mostly do strength conditioning programming stuff. I don't do a lot of or any technical coaching stuff. Like Jesse is a coach that works with my company that does. I refer a lot of that to him or other people that like have that expertise. Where people that come to me, they typically work with someone else as well, and they're looking for very structured kind of organization of their training. Both maybe they've been injured in the past and they're looking to keep injuries away, or they're really well trained and they have a lot of training experience and they want a little bit more precision and nuance with their training to get them that little small percent better. And so my performance stuff is usually pretty niche, but the rehabilitation stuff is that's the majority of what I do is talk to people all day with finger, elbow, and shoulder injuries.
Yeah, which puts you in a really good position to be so knowledgeable about that stuff, which is partly why I like talking to you and having you on the show. We were just talking before about how we've both like niched ourselves into these tiny little spaces in our community. But anyway, can you talk a little bit to just introduce us to your new podcast? Because I know that that just came out.
Oh yeah, so it's kind of a maybe a selfish endeavor for me. It's more like I spend a lot of time reading research papers, and like staying motivated to do that is, it takes time and effort, and like I enjoy doing it. And so the podcast really is myself and Colin, who's a coach that works with me, and we just go through and we talk about pertinent research papers or research papers that I'm interested in. So it just gives me, I say selfish in the sense that I'm not making a lot of money on this. It's on Patreon only, but it's only $5. But it's more like it kind of keeps me up to date and it keeps me searching and looking and finding all these things, and which is good for like professional development and education, but also helpful for generating ideas for social media stuff. And so it has like a multifaceted like reason for doing it, but it's really fun. It's not formatted. We're not like the thing that I have gotten tired of in the last 10 years is having to be overly creative and cute for Instagram. Like I'm kind of over dealing with that, and eventually people like hire companies to do that, but I've never wanted to do that because it's very obvious when someone does that. It's not like the content that I would put out. So it's kind of it's very raw in that sense, which I like.
Yeah, right. And that brings us to today's topic because it is very research based. Why don't you tell us what we're talking about today?
So now, I mean, finger training has been a hot topic for climbing forever. And now people have gotten into doing lifts from the floor with blocks or continued things on the fingerboard. And there's still just this obsession with people increasing the total load that they can lift or hang with, et cetera, on their fingers. And so it's really just giving, hopefully, most climbers kind of a breath of fresh air that chasing those numbers is not going to pay big dividends in the long term. In a lot of cases, it gets people injured.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, it's a question that is on a lot of our minds. Like, how well does finger strength increase uh, actually correlate to climbing performance? Like, when you increase your finger strength by so much, like how much should that mean that your climbing performance increases? So I know that you're not going to give us those specifics, like it's different for every person, but I think that's kind of along the lines of what we're going to be talking about.
Yeah, I think there's a strong we can say there's a strong correlation, and almost all the research would validate that finger strength and strength to weight ratio, more importantly, does have a relationship with climbing harder grades. And those that are climbing at the highest grades definitely have the strongest fingers. But that kind of, when people look at that and when coaches or companies present those metrics and they say, climbers that climb V12 have this strength to weight ratio. And that's probably like, you know, 0.85 to 0.90 strength to weight ratio on one arm. Like people assume then all I have to do to climb V12 is get my fingers that much stronger. And so
Hmm.
the message confuses individuals. I don't know that it's intentional, and I would say it's probably not, especially from the research standpoint. But what the average climber hears is all I have to do is make my fingers stronger, and now I will be able to climb that grade. But that is a total mistake because it misses the whole importance and priority of climbing skills practice and the slow build over many, many years. And it tries to create a shortcut to get to that grade, which usually just leads athletes to getting injured.
Yeah. Okay. And what do you mean by that? And you would know that it makes athletes injured, but what do you see in your clinic?
Well, most of my like experience again is like talking to climbers probably like 3 or 4 per day with finger injuries, and then other injuries with other clients, but lots of athletes with finger injuries. And so you just hear common trends and common things that people are doing. And really it's just like big changes in their training and applying new things and doing too much of this new thing with too rapid of a load, or being prescribed it by a coach that maybe kind of follows maybe a cookie cutter approach to climbers need to do this, this, and this, and they need to do finger training and they need to do these things. But they're not really understanding the physiologic adaptation and the time frame or the intention of the finger training. And they just overload the tissues with too much stuff. And then eventually that leads to people getting tenosynovitis and pulley sprains and maybe pulley ruptures. But it really is just that tolerance for those loads takes a long time to develop.
Mm,
And we see the relationship with the people that are climbing the hardest grades have the strongest fingers, but they also are the best climbers. They've also been doing it most of the time, the longest time frame. Certainly there's outliers that will pop up and climb sick grades in a short time, but most people are slowly building the tolerance to those loads over time. And now because of social media, new people will just like, oh, I see a video of someone doing an epic block lift or a block challenge. Now I'm going to try and see what my personal best is, assuming that they should be able to tolerate that kind of load, which is a huge mistake.
yeah. Well, and ironically, at least from what I've seen from pro climbers, like most of them aren't even training their fingers for most of their career. They're just climbing a lot and climbing really hard. So,
They get a lot of it, and there's a lot of intensity on the fingers with climbing. And a lot of professional athletes that are grabbing onto small holds, the papers would suggest that they're pretty close to the pulley, like the A2 pulley load tolerance on the climbing wall. So both
mm,
the A2 and the A4 pulleys are stressed quite heavily on the climbing wall, and they're constantly pushing their pulleys up close to that threshold and building tolerance, and thus hypertrophy and stiffness and like tissue adaptations that people that don't have all of that repetition will be able to create.
okay.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes sense. So, what is the science that you would like to impart to us today?
Well, the interesting thing that I wanted to talk about was the elite climbers, like their strength to weight ratio with one arm cut off. And most of these numbers are performed on like a 23 millimeter edge and at like a half crimp position. Some of the papers, the tricky thing with the climbing research is there's a lot of variety. And any like one that reads research papers in climbing or any systematic review papers that talk about climbing strength training, there's a whole bunch of variety. And so it's really hard for myself or for anyone to say, this is finger strength training at its best. This is what the strength to weight ratios show consistently, because the testing methods aren't the same, the edge sizes aren't the same, the grip position, the body position, et cetera, aren't always the same. But we can say generally, like the more common edge is like a 23 millimeter edge, and a half crimp is commonly used. And so elite level athletes, strength to weight ratio is usually right close to body weight. So 102-ish% with one arm on a half crimp.
Okay,
The
I'm going to stop
difference,
you. Hold
oh,
on.
go ahead.
I have some clarifying questions. When you say elite, what does that mean?
Elite level climbers would be those like definitely bouldering double digits, high double digits, climbing into the 514 plus five mid 514 range.
Okay. Um and and then what do you mean when you say 100 plus percent?
That means they can hang with one arm on a 23 millimeter edge.
Okay,
And
body weight
so,
or a
and yeah,
little bit
body
more.
weight, full body weight. So that's
Okay.
1 point, that's 102% body weight with one arm. So that's, if they were going to hang with two arms, they would add their whole body weight.
Right. And if they were just to test one arm, it would if they're a 150-pound person, they would test
They'll be able to
150.
pull 150 pounds.
Got it. Okay.
And so the other thing that's really interesting that we've been diving into a lot with this research is there's a couple new papers that have come out that challenge the body position for testing, which is really relevant. And so I've changed my opinion on that and the positions for testing to follow with these, because I agree with their findings and I've used it in the past. And So it's not really sure exactly what's best, but what these papers show is if you're seated with something blocking your hips and then you're pulling down on an edge that's affixed to some sort of strain gauge and your elbows are at 90 degrees, that seems to be a really reliable position and a very like intersession and intrasession reliability. That means it's very predictive for finger strength. And it's like something that can be set up and done very easily. So those positions now, I think, are going to be more of the standard of finger strength testing, even though they don't look as much like rock climbing, like hanging on a fingerboard does. But the numbers that we get a lot of times with the fingerboarding stuff is on a fingerboard where it's really hard to control the grip position and it's really hard to know when the grip position is lost. And so a lot of those numbers, in my opinion, are accentuated in terms of their force because of that, because of the positions. And we've talked about that on other podcasts here before, so we don't need to talk about that too much unless it's something we want to revisit.
No,
But
it's okay. Yeah.
so I think the loads are overestimates of what people can do on a fingerboard.
Got it. Yeah, that makes sense.
One of the, I guess, more important things is the difference between like elite level and what the papers will call higher elite. So like those are just like with finger strength numbers. People climbing at their limit that are the best in our sport, the difference in finger strength between those individuals is not significant. The difference in capacity is more important. And so
What do you
for
mean? What do you mean
so
it's not
like
significant?
for they're all like climbing the same grades approximately, right? But some people have stronger fingers within that highest grade range. So getting stronger fingers for the individuals that are already climbing at the highest grades, they don't need to get stronger fingers. The science would say their capacity is what differentiates them more likely. And
Okay.
so it's another kind of like nuanced message for most athletes that are climbing in like the V6 to V8 range. Yes, we definitely want to train finger strength, but we don't want to assume that we're reaching some strength to weight ratio before we can move or try the next grade, right? It's important for people to have a more well-rounded approach where they're doing finger strength training in conjunction with some sort of capacity training, because capacity seems to be, as important a differentiator as maximum peak force is.
Yeah, and when you say capacity training, you're talking about like and basically repeaters and stuff like
Yeah,
that.
people will do more like work to rest ratios that are more in like the 1.5 to 2 range, or I'm sorry, the 2 to 1 range, where they're hanging for longer and then they're resting and they're doing multiple repetitions of that to build tolerance for, it's like doing a 7-3 times 4-ish repeater, which is the classic example,
Uh-huh. Okay.
and building tolerance and doing other, and but a lot of that capacity stuff comes from climbing practice, from intentionally hard climbing practice that's not always at your limit where you're only falling.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yep.
The numbers that we have that like I put in this folder for you, like this document, the papers where they measure non-climbers and higher elite level climbers maybe is helpful for people to hear. Like
Yeah.
non-climbers, their strength to weight ratio on that 23 mil edge is around 36% body weight. Someone that's like not climbing at all. People that are beginners that have been climbing for maybe a year, 2 years, their strength to weight ratio is close to 50%. So 46%. So that would be someone doing a 2-arm 23 mil edge hang is about the intensity they can tolerate. But advanced climbers, which people that are going to be climbing for 4 years, 5 years, is going to be around 60%. And then when you get into like the V7 to V10 range, then it's going to get into like the 80% strength to weight ratio with one arm. And then the highest elite athletes are going to be the ones that can do a one-arm hang on a 23 mil edge.
Okay. Just to be clear, this is all one arm. This is
Yeah,
one
those numbers are
hand
one
test.
arm. Yeah,
Okay.
those numbers are one arm. And so like a strength to weight ratio of 80% with one arm for most people is like, 1.6 strength to weight ratio. Like from the numbers that I have with testing, I would predict those athletes 1.6, they're probably in the V6 to V8/9 range. But the thing that I
1.6.
the thing
What
that
would
I
that
don't like, say that again.
Can you say, like, if just take a 100-pound person for simplicity, so 1.6.
I'll just do it for myself. So I weigh 170 right now. That would mean my max load, my max peak force would be 272.
Uh-huh.
And so if I subtracted 272 from my body weight, that's 100 pounds over my body weight. So 50 pounds per hand, like
Okay.
over my body weight with two
All right.
arms.
Yeah.
Okay. So what was I going to say? I lost my thought there.
Sorry.
No, that's okay. I think the biggest takeaway message there is athletes are constantly trying to just arbitrarily assume that increasing that number and by any means necessary is going to magically make their climbing skills improve, thus their climbing grade will improve. Where the most important message I think that people can hear and see about those numbers is they're all going to be quite individual, because there's athletes that climb quite hard that don't have strong fingers on paper, and there's also athletes that have ridiculously strong fingers on paper that don't climb very hard.
Right.
And so what we get a lot of, and you see on social media, is people will say, my fingers are so strong, I don't need to train fingers anymore. But that's not really the function of finger strength training. It's to allow someone to practice as much as they can at the level that's relatively hard for them, that they're slowly pushing and inching up over time. Right. And so
Yeah.
people will be too dramatic with their responses when they hear people that don't have strong fingers can climb hard. That means I don't need to train my fingers. No, strength training, and the papers would say, is reducing for injuries. It's helpful to reduce injury risk. And so there's a double benefit to remind people that finger strength training is still a good thing, but it's also important to caution people that they don't just need to like constantly chase and obsess over a number, because the focus still should be all on the climbing wall and their climbing practice.
Okay. Not all, mostly.
Mostly, probably 85%.
Yeah.
90%. The other 10% should be finger strength training, and it should be something that is slow and something that's progressive and something that has good control over the hand positions. And that's something maybe we can talk about with the grip positions and the ability to make it more active as well, which is another way to modulate the amount of intensity you're putting on the fingers.
All right.
Any questions about that for me? That I know
Nope.
I was rambling on a bunch of different topics.
No questions yet.
Okay. So grip position wise, like half crimp position, what's your initial thoughts on what you would do with the body? Like on a fingerboard, I would say the half crimp is a pretty lazy position for most climbers. Like you walk over to a fingerboard, you bend the PIP joint at 90 degrees, and then you just slowly lower. But the primary trajectory in that movement is to just lower and get a really heavy load as you can, right? So instead, if people can get into that lowered position, and then they would be more active with their grip, and then try and actually curl upwards with that position before they lift their feet on the ground, they get more tension in the pulleys and they get more shortening of the muscle, the finger flexors, which will limit the amount of load they can actually engage with. So the load will go down a little bit. But to me, I see that as a net positive for athletes looking to train the muscle, because that's going to be defined, that load will be defined by how much muscle force they can create. Where conversely, if you lower into it, you're stretching the muscle a little bit more, you're going to be able to tolerate more load. But that's not as muscular of a load.
Okay.
Okay. You remember, I'm sure we've talked about that at some point
Yeah.
along the line on this podcast. Familiar with
Yeah.
those. And people now, like with the YouTube videos that I made and other podcasts I've talked on too, like people are pretty familiar with the overcoming style movements and then the more yielding style movements. And that's what I'm referring to there. So if people want to use a fingerboard or they want to use a block lift, I don't think it really matters in terms of the position that they're using, as long as the intention to be more muscular is the focus before they either do the hang or they do the lift from the ground. They're going to get a more muscular kind of load, which will be a little bit lower on the connective tissues of the fingers, and be a little bit more honest with their muscular strength. And I've been for the last couple of years just having people use those loads. So regardless of how they want to train their fingers, those loads with that kind of test will be more indicative of a load that satisfies their individual need.
Okay.
Okay. And so even with the 90-degree bent arm position, which we talked about like on our second podcast, is that's a more muscular load, because if I'm seated and I have to pull on my fingers, I have to make my fingers more engaged and more active. It's hard to be passive in that position. So that position as well adds a little bit more concentric like muscle contraction, which is more predictive for finger strength and it's more repeatable.
Got it.
Okay. The paper before that, which was in kind of the same thing. There's I think 3 papers that measure the fingers in isolation when the elbow's fixed. But the paper we talked about before that used the same 90-degree elbow position, but they affixed the elbow so the elbow couldn't pull. So it's just the finger flexors. That paper also showed that that position was the most reliable when people did test after test. So it's just another example showing how finger strength can be isolated better for a test. And we want people to use that position or those positions for their training loads, even if they're using a fingerboard, because they're going to be a little bit more reliable for the
Uh-huh.
finger strength, but they're also going to be less risky.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, that makes sense.
And I think the block lifting really makes that shine. Like most people that use a fingerboard when they do a one arm hang, like very few people that I've ever seen can do it with a strict half crimp. It's usually like some sort of chisel grip where
Uh-huh.
the outside 2 fingers are kind of open. But with the block lifting stuff, the camera tends to be closer. It's kind of crazy the loads that people do or that people expect for themselves to do. Right? Have you seen tons of those, I'm assuming?
I mean, I've probably seen a few.
Like the block lifting craze is interesting. It's very much like people trying to lift their whole body weight or over their body weight. But I would say the intention of the repetition, the quality of the repetition is lacking in almost all of those videos. Therefore, the adaptation from that exercise is pretty unhelpful, potentially risky. And really, that's where like this kind of mishmash of what we see as reported strength to weight ratios and climbing grades and what we see people doing, it's kind of the chasing the finger numbers that is like I wanted to get on and chat about, just so people maybe get a better understanding or take a breath of fresh air, not thinking that they're not going to make progress because their numbers on the fingerboard or the block aren't making huge progress. That kind of misses the point of why we do it.
Okay. Yeah, I get it.
Okay. Um, any like any clarification things? I think with like the fingerboarding stuff that all makes sense.
Yeah, it all makes sense. And it makes sense that people could get higher numbers than, with certain body positions than they would in these more correct body positions that you're talking about. And that we shouldn't be chasing that and that it might injure us, is what I just heard.
Yeah. So with the argument for the strength training, of course, is to make adaptations that will transfer to our sport, right? And
Right.
so finger strength training or strength training in general, the adaptations are mostly getting stiffness to the connective tissues and getting recruitment to the muscles. And the science would be very confident in saying that heavy things do that. So 65 above percent intensity things make connective tissue stiffer, get more recruitment in the muscle. And so people should do a small amount of that a couple times per week. And for most humans on the planet, that's plenty of finger strength training. But the majority of the slow build and adaptive process comes from climbing itself.
Yeah.
But those athletes that have really strong fingers, they're be able to hang on one arm at a time. Arguably, doing more strength training beyond that is not worth the time. There's more risk there than there is reward, because all those loads have to go through the pulleys and the joint capsules and the cartilage of the fingers. And that's where the allure of getting more is, like in the papers will say that as well. They'll say there's a threshold effect beyond which now is not helpful for sports performance. And that's where it's important to like differentiate the elite versus what they call the higher elite. Is really finger strength does not differentiate those athletes, it's capacity.
Okay. I mean, you say that, but like the higher elite are at 102% and the elite advanced are at like 79%. You're talking about the higher elite versus the higher elite or the higher elite versus the elite advanced?
Well, the differentiation, let me see. I maybe labeled that. Maybe let me double check that. Yeah. So the elite advanced and the higher elite, they're probably climbing similar grades. It's
Okay.
just that the higher elite athletes have stronger fingers. They can do one arm hangs, but they're not necessarily like climbing harder grades.
Okay.
So the important thing there, the differentiator there is like capacity. And
Okay.
so like, you know, you probably had people on the podcast that can climb really hard as we can climb, and they aren't able to do like lots of one arm hang intensity loads.
Uh-huh.
And so, like, how can they do that? The answer is they don't have to have that strong fingers. They need strong fingers, but they don't need to be able to hang at 100% body weight with one arm, right? But it's really hard to convince the general climbing community of that, especially because it is fun as hell to do and it looks awesome and it's fun to try and it's easy to get stronger fingers and it's easy to train and there's a whole bunch of ways to do it. And so the allure of trying to get there is so hard to step away from that we just like I talk to so many people that just do so many things that they just see online and they end up just getting tendinosynovitis in their finger because they're doing their normal stuff, which usually is climbing and then some sort of lifting stuff. And then they add in new things and they just do way too much of it too fast. And they end up having some sort of finger injury that definitely sets them back for a long time.
Yeah. So are you saying that the people listening are like, all right, what percentage am I going for here? If there's a threshold or a point of diminishing returns, what is that point? Is it the 100%?
I mean, that's the thing is like, I never suggest people shoot for some strength to weight ratio on their hand as a goal. Like, there's just too much variation. Some
You
people will
just
never
you
have.
just crushed people's dreams.
I mean, people should try and get stronger fingers.
Yeah.
There's no doubt because having stronger fingers is helpful for practicing more. But genetically and mechanically, some people's fingers just aren't going to get that strong. But if those individuals are chasing some strength to weight ratio, what's going to happen is they're just going to get hurt. They're just going to get injured. And then they're not going to be able to keep practicing climbing skills. And so instead of assuming that someone should be able to hit some strength to weight ratio, it makes way more sense that they test their fingers in a way that replicates or reproduces their finger strength as accurately as possible and pick a load that's sustainable for their fingers on their edge that they tested. And they progressively and slowly keep working at it over long periods of time.
Okay.
Like they don't need to do a 4 week block and then stop. Like they should do like a long block, and those blocks should be done a couple days a week. And you can change the volume of those and the intensity of those as like the periodization scheme, but it really shouldn't stop. But because like you can't get to some strength to weight ratio and then magically have your climb all your climbing goals reached. That's the point. Is that narrative misses the point. Instead of just giving people the okay and the green light to like always train your fingers because getting stronger is protective for injuries and it's helpful for practice. But don't think that you have to reach some goal to climb harder grades that you want to.
Okay.
That makes sense?
But yeah, that makes sense. And then what you have written in this doc that you created was once strength exceeds body weight levels, performance correlations plateau or decline. And then many suggest shifting training focus from strength to power or endurance. So, do you
So
want to dig into
we
more
could
about
like those the like most of the research papers would say that when someone can hang one arm on an edge, like chasing more force on their fingers is not necessary. In my
okay.
mind, that doesn't mean they should stop strength training their fingers because I think strength training has a function still, but the function is not to make them 105%, 110% stronger on their fingers because the relationship there with climbing grade is not the thing that differentiates climbers. It's the capacity of athletes to be able to reproduce 70%, 80%, 85% for more repetitions on a climb. That's a capacity thing,
Yeah, got it.
right? So I think, and it's interesting. There's a lot of myself as one. I'm one of those climbers that has really strong fingers. That my climbing grades on average wouldn't represent the finger strength that I have. But that's just like a genetic thing for me. Like my body is built for with good leverage for producing lots of force, but it's very confusing for the individual. Like I can be okay with that because I know my body and whatever, have other limitations in my lower extremity. But for the average climber, when they hear that they have to reach a certain level until they can climb that grade, or that people climbing that grade have this level, they're really hard on themselves. It's really like, and a lot of people I talk to are so stressed about how strong their fingers are and how they're not climbing as hard as they should be, and how I need to write them a finger strength training program. And that's not at all what I do. I mean, I will
Yeah.
help them. Obviously, I write them a program, but it is not a finger strength problem. That's a send them to a technical coach, give them a little bit less climbing volume so they're not so tired kind of approach. So that's like a program management approach. That's not like a, yeah, you do need stronger fingers because that will make you climb harder grades. That rarely happens.
Yeah. This is,
That was
it
a
sounds it
mouthful.
sounds like you've had a few of these conversations.
I mean, yeah, it's what I do all day. It's what I
Yeah.
talk to clients all day. So instead of like, you try to make short clips on Instagram that give character limits to tell people that, but there's just too much nuance to actually make it helpful. And instead of answering messages all day, it makes sense to just chat
Yeah.
on a podcast, this one or others, about those ideas and how it makes sense and how people can really like not stress so much about, like, I gave a talk at the Bouldering Project last night, and there was mostly new climbers there. The Bouldering Project in Utah is a very unique scene. It's an amazing gym. It's super clean and nice, but there's lots of beginner climbers with rental shoes and people that are just getting into climbing, and then the USA team members because they have a lot of good boards. And so it's like this huge, that's like rapid, polarized like skill level. And so
Yeah.
most of the people that were there to talk on like reducing injury risk were mostly beginners. But it's really interesting to hear even beginners, people that have been climbing for 6 months, they were stressed about their finger strength.
Yeah.
And one of the athletes was so stressed that he was doing campusing because he's strong, doesn't have strong fingers. He was doing campusing, but doing weighted vest campusing. And then at other times in his training, he would just randomly be campusing steep routes in the gym because he's strong and it's fun and it like seems like it would be very practical, but it completely misses the point of getting good practice and learning good climbing skills and putting way too much focus on how much force your fingers can produce. And my suggestion to them was you guys are not grabbing small edges. Like if you want to learn to build tolerance for doing that, using a fingerboard or using a block is okay, but you need to treat it with a lot of caution and you need to do it just like you would with any strength training program, but you just need to do it all the time. But you definitely don't need to start worrying about chasing certain strength weight ratios. That's just going to get them hurt.
Yeah. Well, and speaking of that, you have a whole section here on injury risk and finger strength training. Do you want to talk about the findings on that?
Let me scroll down. I haven't really been looking at the document. Um, I mean, we've talked about it a little bit. We mentioned that the intensity of climbing definitely has a relationship with injuries, and strength training, both upper extremity strength training and finger training, has a relationship with reducing that injury risk. That is, if the programming is such that it's not just additive and it's more balanced. So that essentially that means if someone is doing climbing and they are doing a lot of volume of climbing and they have some sort of chronic injury that pops up, tendinosynovitis or elbow pain, I typically will have those athletes continue to climb always if we can, but then I will give them things that are more intense, not massively intense, but strength training, some finger training. But if I do that, I have to reduce the total volume and I kind of want to make the load on the fingers more even instead of just adding more stuff, which is a big problem when people try and manage injuries on their own. If you're a climber and you have a routine and you like your routine and you're happy with it, you're psyched, you're training, you're trying hard, you're climbing harder, at some point that might lead to some sort of overuse injury. And then when people have an overuse injury, they look online or they watch a video and then they just start adding stuff in. That's the problem of addition with rehab, never works very well. And so that's when they need to be more thoughtful about subtracting some of the things and adding in different things for the sake of being different. But that's a good justification, in my opinion, for persistent and like regular strength training on the upper extremity and the fingers.
Yeah.
But I would
So,
also I would also add one thing. I would also say I rarely hear people actually getting their fingers hurt while fingerboarding. There's been
yeah.
one case where I've had some athlete like get like a pop when they're doing like a hard effort on a fingerboard or with a block lift, but it's not common to hear people have like acute injuries when they're doing those loads. And that's really because the loads are heavy and they're slow. Most of the time with pulley ruptures, people are in an aggressive position and then a foot slips. So it's kind of a rapid load. And the rapid shock load is the thing usually that gets people acute injuries. But just because people using heavy loads don't experience acute injuries, that doesn't mean that those loads aren't meaningful or, you know, helping. Not that that's a good word. They're not contributing to someone having an acute injury in the future.
Yeah, it seems like yeah, exactly. When I hear about people who have finger injuries, a lot of times it's like I was training my fingers a lot and I was climbing a lot and it was just too much.
Absolutely. I just talked to someone that had elbow pain today, and they were doing a climbing program and they were doing great, feeling awesome. And then their pulley got sore, and they kind of knew what to do because they've had a sore pulley before. So they backed off the climbing, they backed off some of the other things, but then they did a whole bunch of fingerboarding. And they started adding weight to the fingerboarding, which they weren't doing before. And so it's not that like adding weight to the fingerboarding is bad. It's really that they just changed the thing that they were doing a little bit too quickly, and then just did more intensity than they could tolerate for that period of time. And the inside of the elbow got sore. And
Uh-huh.
nothing really changed other than they started doing more intense fingerboarding. And I would contribute that to being the cause.
Yeah, got it.
Right. So the message there is like, it's not that the fingerboarding causes medial elbow pain, and it's not that climbing causes finger injuries. It's just like a balance of tissue tolerance that's always changing that athletes need to be thoughtful about so they can not get hurt, you know, which is
Yeah.
a damn hard thing to understand. So the hardest thing there is like, you can't always predict that. I can't predict it. You can't predict it. Like, it's just really hard to do. So we always have to consider the loads that we're using, track the workouts that we have, track the volume, know that your strength doesn't just disappear, that strength sticks around as long as you're doing stuff. You know, spreading workouts out is okay. Crunching them together is okay if you're going on a trip. Like there's really a lot of confidence that gets lost when people get hurt, but structurally there's no reason to feel fragile when you have a pain complaint. It
Yeah.
tends to be more dramatic.
Okay. Well, what else do you want to cover here?
I don't know that there's a ton of things. I don't. I mean, we've talked a ton about this, and people I think mostly know my perspective on those ideas. I figured it would be just helpful to give kind of a well-rounded kind of approach on people knowing that the climbing skills and the consistent climbing practice is enough for people to build a lot of cross-sectional area in their tendons, cross-sectional area in their joints and their volar plates, and make their fingers capable of tolerating more climbing stress. I think now when I started climbing, there was fingerboards, but there was no Instagram, and finding information was like hard to do. There was maybe some training blogs, but I was in Colorado and I didn't really know or care, and I was just psyched and I wanted to climb. And so there was no way to get stronger fingers except for just like exposing yourself to climbing and harder climbing over time. That principle, and that worked great. That principle still holds true. And I think now, though, it's much harder for people that get into rock climbing and they're excited about it to take that approach, because all you have to do is look on an app or look on a forum or watch YouTube videos and they will get psyched, just like people that have been climbing a long time will get psyched. But warning people about that is, I think, important, because typically what that does is that just leads people down a rabbit hole of chronic injuries, both to the elbow and the fingers. And it's just like really frustrating and confusing.
Yeah, for sure. It is. Well, it seems like people have some information to go on, and more than anything, what I feel like you've done today is give people a good dose of caution and, like you said, a breath of fresh air, like a little bit of relief. Like, you don't have to be Allison Best in order to climb hard, or whoever else out there has super crazy strong fingers. Um, we just have to use our intuition and like common sense, really, and not overdo it.
Maybe one of the coolest things that I did not mention is there's one paper where they measured climbers and with different ability levels, and they actually used a custom climbing wall that had measuring devices on the holds, which for sure will be in the future of rock climbing. They're
Yeah,
just,
that's cool.
the technology is really expensive right now. But in another 20 years, I would predict that we'll have climbing walls with force sensors on every hold. And
Uh-huh.
so when they do that and they measure climbers of different climbing ability levels, the people that are climbing the higher grades, even when they climb the same problem, use less force on the hands.
Whoa.
And so it's not that they use like this, like it's not because someone else asked it, well, is that because their relative strength is higher? But no, no, no. They actually measure the forces on the holds and they use less force on their hands, which is an efficiency. That's a technique thing. And so the other thing that people want to maybe take away that is a really important message in my mind, getting stronger fingers on a digital scale or on a fingerboard does not and should not equate to you applying more force on a climbing hold when you're climbing. Like
Hmm.
that's not the point. The
I
point is
like
not
that.
to like use more energy on a climbing hold. The point is to develop coordination in a specific grip, develop some connective tissue adaptation, which is stiffness in your connective tissue so you can hold that position, and like have more hand moves that you can perform move after move so you can practice more. Not because
Yeah.
you want to grab and squeeze harder, because that would just use more energy. And so when we look at those studies, it's really cool. And there's not big sample sizes, but it's really cool to see that they're just better at positioning their body under their hands, which means they need to use less force per hold, which means they have a greater capacity as well.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. That's super cool. Love that.
Like, I think that's so awesome for people to hear. And that should, everyone should hear that as people hear it one or two ways. One of the ways is like, oh, so I don't need strong fingers. I don't need finger strength training. Doesn't matter. That's not true. The other thing that people say is like, I have too strong of fingers. I shouldn't strength train. I just need to work on technique. It's like everyone needs to work on technique. Everyone needs to work on the skills of climbing and practice. But I would argue everyone should strength train too. It'll probably be a different load, might be different grips based on their individual needs or where they climb outside, what they like to do. But it's not a good justification to say strength training is not helpful because I don't need it on the wall or my fingers are strong enough. The justification for it is just to make sure the tissues are tolerant of climbing practice so people can do more climbing practice or as much as they can tolerate so they can get better.
Uh-huh. Yeah, that makes sense. Okay,
Where someone asks,
any final thoughts?
no, no, I think that's the majority of things. I mean, that document, as you can tell, is like a long list of topics and numbers and things, but like going through and itemizing all that, like I do that more to remind myself of the hard objective things so I can just kind of like talk about it more casually, hopefully. So I don't think there's anything on that we really missed necessarily. We don't need to talk about numbers in terms of pulley load tolerance per se.
Do you want to share this doc with people?
I'd probably want to fine tune it a little bit more if you want. Maybe I can do an article if you want to do an article for the website. That might
Yeah,
work.
or you could just fine tune this. I think that the nerds would like it. Whatever
Okay.
you want.
Yeah, I'm okay with that.
Okay, so
I'll just fine tune it. I'll make an article about it. That would be better.
okay, well, so stay tuned for that, everyone. All
Cool. I
right,
think that
well,
sums it up.
yeah, thanks, Tyler. I appreciate it, and it's always nice talking to you. So
Yep.
thank
Nice
you.
to see you as well.
All right, have a good one. I'll talk to you soon.
Bye.
All All right, I hope you enjoyed that episode with Dr. Tyler Nelson. Again, you can find him at C4HP on Instagram, on Patreon at C4HP, and at camp4humanperformance.com. And the 4 is a number. So he does clinics, he does consultations, he has online programs, he has all kinds of resources for you, and his new podcast on Patreon. Tyler's great. Love Tyler. Love having him on the show, and I always learned something. And hopefully you did too. If you need help with your training, we are here for you. You can go to trainingbeta.com where we have ebooks for climbing training programs. We have subscription programs for boulders and route climbers. We have individualized coaching with Alex Steiger and Matt Pincus. And they work with climbers of all abilities from anywhere in the world to help them reach their goals given any restraints that they have, equipment that they have available to them, and anything else. It's very individualized and they are super successful with their clients. I'm also currently taking a couple new clients for mindset coaching if you want to work with me on things like fear in climbing. If you're just not having a great time with climbing anymore, if you're comparing yourself, feeling shameful, it's not feeling fun anymore. Those are typically the kinds of people who come to me, but I also work with people on whatever they want with coaching. So you can go to trainingbeta.com and just go to the mindset tab and you can find me there. You can find us on Instagram at trainingbeta, and that is all for today. Thank you so much for listening all the way to the end, and I'll talk to you next time.